I can't see a world in which I would be bringing my wife and children back to the UK at this point.
And now they can be in the next door room on a tablet or on a phone and can be going down these rabbit holes.
There are some royal tensions that arrive in public with cameras, statements, and carefully arranged smiles. Then there are the tensions that begin in private. They didn't want him to be a prince or a princess, not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol. Move through corridors in lowered voices and gather force long before the public has any idea that anything has shifted at all. This was the second kind. No announcement opened the day. No palace spokesperson stepped forward to frame the atmosphere. No one at the gates would have guessed that inside the walls, one of the most disciplined figures in the royal family, had decided that a line of uncertainty had gone on long enough. Yet, from the moment Princess Anne entered the room, the tone changed. Not because she raised it, not because she needed to. In that family, there are people whose authority depends on rank. And there are people whose authority depends on something older, harder, and more difficult to resist. And belongs to the second category. She does not spend her life courting attention. She has never needed headlines in order to be taken seriously. She has built her standing the long way, the way that leaves the deepest mark through years of duty, through consistency, through the kind of steadiness that cannot be performed for a season and then put away. When Anne chooses to involve herself in something sensitive, the family notices, staff notice, advisors notice. Most of all, the people on the receiving end of that attention notice. That is what made the atmosphere so heavy from the beginning. Because this was not about a casual disagreement. It was not about one briefing, one headline, or one more round of public bitterness between royal camps already used to being watched. This was about something larger and more delicate. It was about where Archie and Lilibet fit inside the royal story now. Not emotionally, not sentimentally, structurally, publicly, historically. It was about the difference between affection and architecture, between family feeling and institutional clarity, between what people hope will settle itself over time and what someone eventually decides must be addressed directly. That someone on this occasion was Princess Anne. The questions had not appeared all at once. That is rarely how these things work. They had accumulated quietly at first, then more heavily. Over time, a pattern had formed, and what had once been treated as a subject too volatile to press too firmly had started to look from inside palace logic, like a subject too important to keep drifting, not because anyone wished harm on the children. Quite the opposite, that is what made it so fraught. In a family where almost every symbolic issue becomes emotional the moment it touches children, the need for clarity can become even harder to discuss. Nobody wants to be seen as cold. Nobody wants to look suspicious. Nobody wants to step into territory that can instantly be framed as cruelty. Anne knew all of that. She stepped in anyway because from where she stood, the problem was no longer the discomfort of asking difficult questions. The problem was what continued uncertainty would do if no one asked them at all. To understand why Anne moved when she did, you have to understand the kind of role she occupies inside the monarchy. She is not ornamental. She is not a floating ceremonial figure who exists to smile through state occasions and disappear. Anne understands machinery. She understands lineage, sequence, institutional memory, precedence, and the strange but very real importance of making sure that what is said publicly can survive private scrutiny years later. She grew up in a world where small inaccuracies do not stay small. They expand. They are revisited. They are recorded. They return at the worst possible time and under the hardest possible light. That matters because Archie and Lilibet do not exist in the royal story simply as children known to the public through occasional photographs and scattered reports. They exist in the monarchy's long chain of meaning. They exist in relation to titles, succession, public expectation, and an institution that has always relied on clarity, even when family life itself refuses to stay clear. The problem, as Anne saw it, was not that the children themselves had done anything. Children never create these storms. Adults do. The problem was that the adults around them had spent years allowing public contradictions, emotional narratives, and private grievances to tangle around their place in the family without ever deciding where the lines actually stood. at some point, and concluded that had to stop. The room in which the conversation began was not large. That was deliberate. Grand rooms are useful for ceremony, but smaller rooms are where the monarchy says its hardest things. Smaller rooms remove performance. They make silence feel nearer. They prevent people from hiding inside spectacle, and prefers rooms like that when the subject matters. They force everyone to confront the point. No one can pretend they have not heard. No one can let the eye wander to chandeliers, portraits, polished silver, or the larger comforts of royal theater. In a smaller room, the issue sits on the table with the papers. There were papers. That detail matters because and does not conduct serious conversations through vague feeling alone. She came prepared. Notes, timelines, public statements, internal references, questions not only about what had been said before, but about what had been left unsaid, what had shifted, what had been implied, and what that accumulation now meant for the institution. This was not a scene built on temper. It was built on method. That is what made it more intimidating. Harry understood immediately what kind of conversation this was. People who underestimate him often assume that he moves only from emotion. That is too simple. Harry understands hierarchy instinctively because he grew up inside it. He knows the difference between a family complaint and an institutional challenge. He knows what it means when and takes an issue out of the fog of general grievance and places it inside the language of royal order. He may resist it. He may resent it. He may interpret it as hostility. But he does not fail to recognize it. That was clear from the way he entered. Not relaxed, not casual, not openly aggressive either. He carried the look of someone already brazen. Already expecting that the discussion would not be about comfort or reconciliation, but about definition. Meghan came in with a different energy, more composed on the surface, more alert to presentation, more aware that in rooms like these, the structure of the conversation can decide the outcome before anyone has finished their first sentence. She was not wrong about that, and had structured this one carefully, and began. She did not start with accusation. That would have been easy, and easy is rarely her style. She started with principle. That is how disciplined royal figures tighten a conversation before anyone realizes the walls have closed in. She spoke about the burden of consistency, about the monarchy's dependence on records that match public declarations, about the difference between a family telling itself that time will smooth confusion and an institution knowing that confusion preserved too long becomes future damage. She did not dramatize. She did not reach for emotional effect. That restraint gave the words more weight. Then she moved to the core of it. Archie and Lilibet, she said in substance, if not those exact words, could not go on existing inside a structure of shifting emotional interpretation. Their place had to be clearly understood. Their status had to be matched by coherent explanation. The palace could not remain in a position where every new public discussion of titles, roles, appearances, proximity, security, expectation, and distance reopened the same unresolved questions from a new angle. That was not sustainable. Not for the monarchy, not for the children, not for the family either, if the family had any desire left to keep its own private confusion from becoming public inheritance. That is when the room truly tightened, because Harry and Meghan had heard something more than concern. They had heard a demand for clarity framed in institutional language. And institutional language inside royal life is always more dangerous than emotion because it is harder to dismiss as a mood. Feelings can be waited out. Procedures cannot. Hurt can be deferred. Formal questions have a way of returning until they are answered. Harry pushed back first, not recklessly, not in a shout, but with the sharpened intensity of someone who feels the conversation has crossed from care into intrusion. He made the familiar point from his side that his children should not be treated as problems to be managed, that they were family, that too much of what had followed them already had come from coldness, suspicion, briefing, and a willingness inside palace culture to let distance harden into judgment. Underneath his words was something older. The rawness of a man who believes his branch of the family has repeatedly been asked to prove itself by standards others were never forced to perform under pressure. and listened. That matters because her stillness in difficult moments is often mistaken for softness. It is not softness. It is evaluation. She lets people complete themselves before she decides where to place the knife of the issue. Harry finished. Meghan added to the line of defense, though hers was different in emphasis, less about personal injury, more about the optics of what Hen's questions could become if misread, mishandled, or leaked. She was not wrong to think in those terms. Much of royal conflict lives and dies by interpretation. A badly framed internal conversation can become an external catastrophe. Meghan has lived enough of that to know it. Anne's answer was not harsh. It was more difficult than harsh. She brought the conversation back to the children and refused to let it rest on adult wounds alone. That was the move that changed everything, because once the subject becomes only Harry and Meghan's treatment by the institution, the discussion can widen into old battles with no stable ending. Anne did not permit that. She narrowed it. The children, she insisted, were precisely why the questions could not be left hanging. If their place in the royal story mattered, and clearly it did, then the adults around them had a duty to ensure that place rested on unambiguous foundations. That meant coherent records. That meant stable explanations. That meant a willingness to address what had become sensitive without pretending sensitivity itself removed the need. In other words, Anne was saying that love is not the same thing as structure. And structure in monarchy always wins eventually. This was the point at which panic, not in the melodramatic sense, but in the deeper private sense, began to creep into the room. It did not show as chaos. It showed as calculation under pressure. Harry realized that Anne was not simply voicing concern. She was establishing a principle that could reshape how the palace handled Archie and Lilibet going forward. Meghan realized something related but distinct. Once Anne made the issue one of institutional coherence rather than personal grievance, it became much harder to frame any resistance as purely defensive or justified. It began to look like resistance to clarity itself. That was a dangerous position, and pressed the point with the patience of someone who had waited long enough to earn the right to press it. She did not speak in circles. She asked what supporting materials existed, what had been formally communicated, what remained informal, what expectations had been implied to the public, what assumptions had been allowed to spread, and why the family should keep tolerating a situation in which so much rested on emotional sensitivity while basic institutional questions still produced visible discomfort. Every question was simple enough to understand. Together they were suffocating because each one forced Harry and Meghan into the same corner. Answer directly and narrow the mystery. Deflect and confirm that the mystery still mattered. That is what made Anne's method so effective. She did not accuse. She framed unanswered questions as instability. Once that frame was in place, everything else in the room bent toward it. Harry's frustration rose, not explosively, more heavily. He returned to the language of trust, betrayal, family protection, and the repeated sense that his household had never been granted the goodwill extended to others. He was not inventing those feelings. They are central to how he understands nearly every royal conflict now. Yet in this room they had less force than usual because Anne was not denying the pain. She was stepping around it. She was saying in effect that pain does not remove the monarchy's need to know what it is presenting to history. That is a brutal argument to face when you are already tired, already distrustful, and already convinced the institution has never met you halfway. Meghan saw where the conversation was going and tried a different path. She moved toward the children's dignity, privacy, and welfare, emphasizing how inappropriate it would be for palace figures to speak about them in a way that turned their lives into objects of cold institutional review. That line might have worked on someone more publicly exposed, more eager to protect image before substance. It did not move Anne very far, and has spent too many years inside the hardest parts of royal duty to mistake firmness for indifference. She knows the monarchy's great weakness is that it often waits too long to clarify things because it fears seeming unkind. Then when the confusion finally breaks open, everyone wishes the questions had been asked sooner. She had no intention of making that mistake now. So she said what no one in the room wanted said plainly. Archie and Lilibet were no longer only family children being discussed through private affection. They had become fixed points in a wider story about royal legitimacy, distance, inheritance, public association, and the shape of the monarchy's future. That did not make them less beloved. It made the adults around them more responsible. The palace could not keep pretending their place would define itself through emotion alone. Their future standing would either be supported by complete confidence and coherent process, or it would remain vulnerable to every new wave of public speculation and internal discomfort, and was not willing to leave them inside that kind of uncertainty. The silence after that landed harder than anything that had been said before because that was the heart of it, and was not attacking the children. She was arguing that refusing clarity around them was its own form of failure. That reframed the entire discussion. Harry looked cornered by the reframing because it robbed him of the simpler moral ground. He could no longer say the palace was merely being cold or punitive, and had positioned herself as the one taking their long-term place seriously enough to insist the foundations be settled. Meghan understood the danger in that immediately. Once and occupies the position of the person protecting future coherence, opposition starts to look less like resistance to injustice and more like resistance to being pinned down. This is where Princess Anne differs from almost everyone else in the family. She does not need to win a room emotionally in order to dominate it. She wins structurally. She identifies the point around which all softer arguments eventually collapse. Then she builds everything on that point until the others are forced to speak inside her frame rather than their own. By then the balance has shifted. That is exactly what had happened here. The conversation moved into even more difficult territory after that. Not sensationally, not in a way that could be reduced to one shocking line. It became difficult because it became specific. Timelines, communication gaps, public labels, private expectations, what had been assumed, what had been allowed, what the palace had accepted out of caution, what it would no longer leave vague. The closer and moved to particulars, the more visible Harry's discomfort became. Meghan's too, though hers remained better contained on the surface. For both of them, the danger lay in the same thing. Specificity removes room to live inside moral atmosphere. It asks people to stand on facts, procedures, and exact understandings. That is much harder terrain when trust has long since broken down. At one point, Harry asked with visible strain why Anne had decided to make this her issue at all. That question revealed more than it intended. It assumed and was stepping beyond her place. Her answer, calm and immediate, made clear that from her perspective, she was stepping into precisely the place she had always occupied. The place of the person in the family who says what should have been said earlier. The place of the person who sees the cost of postponing difficult clarity and refuses to decorate that postponement with false compassion. She said enough in essence to communicate one thing unmistakably because someone had to. That landed hard too because it exposed the larger truth haunting the room. This issue had not been addressed clearly by those who might once have done so. Charles had his reasons for caution. William had his own reasons for distance. Advisors often prefer postponement when emotion runs hot. Yet postponement creates its own pressure, and eventually that pressure seeks the family member least intimidated by discomfort. That family member was Anne. The longer the meeting continued, the more evident it became that what Harry and Meghan were experiencing was not simply disagreement, but narrowing, and was reducing the number of ways this subject could remain misty. Every answer they gave either advanced the clarity she wanted or revealed how much fog still surrounded the issue. Both results strengthened her position. That is why the meeting felt so punishing. There was no explosive accusation to fight against. There was only the steady removal of evasive space. By the time tea arrived, hardly anyone touched it. That detail may sound small, but in royal settings, the small details often reveal the mood more accurately than the official tone. Untouched tea means people are no longer moving through the rituals that normally soften hard conversations. The script of civility is still present. The body has quietly stopped believing in it. That was the state of the room by then. Harry had begun pacing verbally, even while seated, returning to themes he trusted because they had carried him through so many public battles before. Family hurt, the double standard, the injustice of scrutiny. Meghan's emphasis moved more toward consequences. She warned carefully but unmistakably that lines of questioning once formalized could create new fractures and new interpretations far beyond anything the palace might think it was containing. She was right in one sense. There is no such thing as a purely internal royal issue once language hardens around it. Yet Anne's view was harder still. She had already decided that failing to harden the language was the greater risk. This is where the meeting crossed from tense into transformative, and made clear that closed-door discomfort would no longer be used as a reason for institutional vagueness. She wanted answers, yes, but more than that, she wanted settled understanding. She wanted the children's place described in terms the palace could actually stand behind in the future without constant reinterpretation. She wanted the adults around the issue to stop expecting emotion to carry what only coherence can carry. And she wanted everyone in that room to understand that from this point forward the subject would not drift untended simply because people were afraid of how the question sounded. That was the moment Harry and Meghan truly understood that and was not there to vent concern and then move on. She was there to begin a process. Processes are what frighten royal households most when they can no longer control the spirit in which they begin. A single argument can be denied, softened, outweighed, forgotten, or reframed. A process has memory. It leaves traces. It generates expectations. It invites follow-up. It turns one difficult afternoon into the first step of something larger. Harry and Meghan could feel that the panic, if the word is to mean anything serious here, lived in that realization, not that one question had been asked, that the era of being able to float above the question might be ending, and did not enjoy this. That is an important point. Nothing in her manner suggested triumph. She is not the type to feed on discomfort for its own sake. In a way, that made the meeting grimmer. She was doing what she believed duty required, not what private emotion desired. And duty in that family often lands harder because it arrives without heat. It gives no easy villain to resist. It leaves people angry at a system speaking through a person disciplined enough not to flinch. As the discussion drew toward its close, the outlines of the new reality were already visible. Archie and Lilibet would remain deeply loved by the people who loved them. That had not changed. But their symbolic place would no longer be permitted to hover in a zone of permanent sensitivity where every attempt at clarity could be dismissed as cruelty. And had broken that pattern. Once broken, such patterns are difficult to restore. Harry sensed the loss in that immediately. Not a loss of love, a loss of leverage. The ability to hold the palace at a distance while also expecting it to carry unresolved ambiguities indefinitely had come under serious pressure. Meghan sensed something equally important. The moral center of the issue had shifted. As long as the conversation could be framed mainly around jury, they had familiar ground, and had moved the ground beneath them. Now the issue could be described as one of responsibility toward the children's future place. That is a far harder framing to reject without cost. When the chairs finally moved and the room began to empty, no one rushed to fill the silence with false reassurance. That alone told the truth of the day. Royal families are experts at ending difficult moments with just enough politeness to preserve movement. Even that mechanism seemed thinned here. And gathered her papers slowly. Harry stood without the release people usually show when an ordeal ends. Meghan remained poised, but the poise had changed shape. It now looked less like control and more like recalculation. Outside the room, the palace carried on exactly as palaces do. Footmen moved, doors opened, cars stood ready, clerks handled schedules. The architecture of monarchy is built to make private strain look absorbable. Yet beneath that surface, everyone closest to the issue would have felt the same thing. Something had shifted from emotional standoff to institutional handling. Those are two different worlds. In the first world, people fight over narrative. In the second, systems begin to form. And systems, once and has taken an interest, rarely form by accident. The wider meaning of the meeting extended beyond Archie and Lilibet themselves. It revealed something about the royal family at this stage of its own history. Charles still leads, but his reign is a bridge between eras. William represents the next structure. Harry lives outside that structure while remaining entangled with it. Meghan continues to understand the power of public story better than many inside the palace. And Anne, as ever, stands in the strange but crucial position of being trusted precisely because she is so uninterested in performing trustworthiness. She simply does the hard thing again and again. That gives her a freedom the others often lack. This meeting proved that freedom still matters. It also proved that the monarchy has entered a phase where ambiguity around the next generation, even around children not on the central path, is being viewed with less tolerance than before. The institution is becoming more protective of future coherence because it knows what damage confusion can do when it is left to age, and has lived long enough to see that pattern repeat. She has no patience left for it. So what did Harry and Meghan panic over in the deepest sense? Not one question, not one phrase, not even one difficult afternoon. They panicked because Anne had done something the palace had resisted doing for too long. She had turned sensitivity into a reason for clarity instead of a shield against it. She had taken a subject wrapped for years in emotional caution and dragged it into the harder light of institutional necessity. She had done it without cruelty, without spectacle, without giving them a dramatic out. And that is always the hardest kind of pressure to fight. Because once the most disciplined woman in the family says the issue can no longer remain blurred, blur itself starts to look like the threat. That is what the day will be remembered for by the people closest to it. Not the gossip, not the exaggerations people outside may attach later. They will remember the moment Princess Anne decided that Archie and Lilibet's place in the royal story deserved something stronger than perpetual emotional fog. They will remember that Harry and Meghan walked into a conversation expecting resistance and found instead a framework. They will remember that the room did not explode because it did not need to. Its power came from the opposite of explosion. It came from pressure that did not need to rise in volume to become absolute. And they will remember one more thing, that once Anne had said it, no one in the room could honestly pretend the questions did not exist anymore. That is why the meeting mattered. That is why its silence was so heavy. And that is why for Harry and Meghan, the real panic began only after the door opened and they understood that what had just happened was not an isolated clash, but the beginning of a new kind of royal reckoning.